everyone to the Flowing Sales podcast. We are excited today. We're talking about the renewables industry, big industry, doing nothing but growing. Lots of manufacturers and reps obviously very interested in the space for good reason. And I think it's going to keep growing as we move into the future here. So we are very excited to have Rudy Wodrich with us. He's an expert in the space, been working in it for a long time. Works at Siemens, one of the largest manufacturers in the world, and they're very big in the renewables space, as you may know. So Rudy, welcome to the show. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. And what we're going to do today is we'll have a little introduction from Rudy to tell you his experience. Then we're going to go into kind of the top 10 things. We're going to hit 10 things that Rudy's seen. He has some studies, some data we're going to go over. So it's going to be really interesting about how to make solar projects, specifically with inverters, successful. So you can avoid the pitfalls and you can make sure you're going to get the biggest ROI out of your projects. So Rudy, you mind giving a quick bio of yourself?
Sure. So I'm Rudy Wodrich. I'm the director of the Green Technologies business for Siemens Industry here in the United States. Basically, our team takes care of the hardware requirements for solar projects as well as energy storage. And we're very soon going to be migrating into the power conversion piece required for green hydrogen electrolyzers as well. So basically, we take care of all of everything from the medium voltage switchgear down to the inverters on solar projects. And we really focus very specifically on utility scale and community solar. So community solar would be projects in the 1 megawatt to 5 megawatt ground mount. And then utility scale is really anything bigger than that. And we have a couple of different types of solutions. Specifically today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the 10 things to consider when you are designing a utility scale project or community solar project using string inverters. We also have a central inverter product line. And maybe at the end, we'll talk a little bit as a bonus topic about when's the right time to migrate your design topology from string to central.
That sounds great. So let's dive into the 10 here and we'll go through. The first one I thought was interesting, and that's noise pollution, and which I wouldn't have thought of necessarily. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, these community solar projects are typically just that. They're in the community, right? They are quite often located or co-located with residential areas. And it's important to consider the impact of any project on your neighbors. So you need to look at the noise level, the audible noise level out of the equipment that you're going to be installing. And inverters tend to be potentially the noisiest component that you're going to install on the project. Solar panels don't make any noise, but inverters and transformers definitely do. Inverters do because they're switching IGBT devices, semiconductors at very high frequency that can generate a lot of audible noise that can transmit across the field to the neighbors. So I always tell people be very cautious. There are some products on the market that have audible noise declarations that are in the 70 to 80 decibel range. The units that we sell are less than 60 decibels. And with audible noise, you have to keep in mind that a 10 decibel difference actually means that something is twice as loud. So if you go from 60 to 70 decibels, it's twice as loud. If you go from 60 to 80 decibels, it's 4 times as loud. So, this is something to consider. There have been a couple of high profile instances of the local homeowners association or residents banding together and suing a renewable energy project over audible noise concerns that happened after the commissioning. So it was something that wasn't taken into account during the design. And then the developer, had to do some mitigation techniques after the fact to deal with the audible noise, whether that be the planting of trees or adding of, earthen berms around the exterior of the project. All of these things can add to your project cost. So it's certainly something that you need to consider as part of the design process.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you said yours are around 60 and usually they're about 70. Can you give us just what sound is about 60 decibels versus 70?
60 decibels is probably about the level that we're speaking at. That's kind of a, conversation in a standard, sort of room. 70 decibels is someone really kind of, speaking really loudly or yelling. It's kind of typical for equipment noise, like a tractor or something like that running. 80 decibels is like a freight train going by. So, you have to think about this in terms of, how is it going to impact the neighbors? This is not something that's exclusive to our industry. There was recently I can't remember if it was 2020 or 60 Minutes, talking about data centers, and the proliferation of data centers, specifically in like, Arkansas and Mississippi, where they didn't put any regulation in place. And there are now homeowners there that are at their wits' end because they can't live with the noise from the adjacent facility. So you have to be mindful of this. You have to be a good neighbor. You have to be conscious of this as part of the design process. We don't want solar to get a black eye, with the very communities that we want to serve.
Yeah, that's great. Moving on to number two, right? So we talked about noise pollution. Now let's talk about efficiencies. And when you were talking to me about this earlier, even efficiencies of a fraction of a percent is significant, right? So talk
Yep.
to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so efficiency of the inverter basically means how much of the DC energy gets converted into usable AC energy, right? And how much of it is lost as waste, mostly heat. Through the power conversion process. It's a very important metric for a couple of reasons. One is that a less efficient inverter will generate more heat, and heat is the most damaging long term to the reliability of any power electronics component. Is its heat. That's what kills power electronics and electronics in general. So anything that's got higher losses, lower efficiency is going to over time have a impact on the longevity of the components inside that device. But that's kind of secondary. The bigger concern for project owners is yield. How much energy are they going to be able to convert and into usable, sellable energy at the meter at their point of common coupling? And so inverter efficiency is by far the biggest impact there. A half a point of efficiency differential between one inverter versus another inverter can add up to $300 to $350 per year per megawatt for the project. So when you start talking larger projects, this starts to add up fairly quickly. So on a 100 megawatt project, you're now talking, $30,000 a year. So this starts to add up as to how much energy you're going to be able to harvest and turn that into revenue for your project and cover the cost of the assets that you've put into service. So there are most of the inverters that are out there, they are fairly common for them to have a 98.5% efficiency, which sounds really good. The inverters that Siemens puts into the market, both our string and our central inverters, are 99% efficiency per CEC. And the CEC efficiency metric is one that's done across the spectrum of operation. So it's basically measurement that's done at 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, all the way up to 100% output power. And then they take the blended average of that to come up with the CEC efficiency rating on the units.
Got it. And you have studies that show this. We'll include those in the show notes, by the way, if anyone's interested, you want to download that and have a look at it. So inverter efficiency is super important. Third one on the list here is MTBF, specifically design complexity. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So when we look at any power electronics device, one of the things that we look at is minimizing parts count. Right? How many different components are there in the unit? Because if we can reduce the number of components, we will reduce the mean time between failures in general, right? So we try to simplify designs to the greatest extent possible. Now, some of the products that are on the market, they include an extra power conversion stage. They're called multi-MPPT units, right? So they actually convert the DC power coming in from the array that's typically coming in at up to 1500 volts DC, and they have a boost. So they increase the voltage level on the DC to a higher level before the primary power conversion stage that turns it into AC. So they boost the DC to a higher level first, and then they push it through the main body of the inverter to output to a higher voltage level on the AC side. The challenge there is that you've got this extra DC to DC boost stage, and you've got multiples of them. So on a typical multi-MPPT inverter, you could have 12 to 16 or even higher channels of these boost stages. So that means there's 12 to 16 sets of these DC to DC boost converters inside the unit, which increases the parts count, which frankly, in my opinion, gives you a weak spot from a reliability perspective. So if any of those components fail inside one of those boost stages, it potentially takes your entire inverter down. So we always think about simplification of designs, and our units are a single MPPT design, but what we've also discovered is that adds to the efficiency, but it also adds to the reliability of the unit. So we get higher efficiency because that extra boost stage There's losses associated with that, which is why you see lower efficiencies in the first place. So it ties back to point two, right, that we already talked about, the overall efficiency, but it also potentially creates a reliability weakness in the design. The other thing I would mention about the multi-MPPT units is that they are touted by the people that sell them as being generating higher yields for your project because they deal with what I call corner cases where you might have uneven levels of soiling or dirtiness on the modules from different parts of the array. And they say, well, if there's a mismatch between the module strings for some reason, whether that be because of the length of the strings, the number of modules in the string, which is unusual. You usually wouldn't have different string lengths on a utility scale project. On rooftops, sometimes you do, but on utility scale, they're typically homogeneous. They're always the same number of modules in a string. But if you had soiling mismatch, if you had rapid cloud movement moving overhead where part of the array might be shaded while the other is not, there are instances there where you can get a higher yield with these multi-MPPT inverters because each channel is maximizing the power output by adjusting the voltage on the channel. However, those use cases are so infrequent that they actually occur in real life that don't make up for the 0.5% efficiency penalty that you take just by having that extra boost stage in there. So we had commissioned the Fraunhofer Institute, which is a widely regarded German research group, to actually look at these multi-MPPT versus single MPPT inverters a couple of years ago. And their conclusion essentially was that there's no real advantage in utility scale projects. There's no real advantage to having multi-MPPT, and that penalty from the efficiency perspective more than cancels out any benefit you get from those corner cases.
Interesting. So more of a theoretical benefit, but for all practical purposes, you're not going to see it.
Yeah, if you're designing rooftop arrays and there's issues with shading, right? This is the other thing that they bring up is like, well, what about shading, from trees? Well, if you've designed a utility scale project properly, you've kept the perimeter away from the trees, right? What about inter-row shading where the beginning or at the end of the day, the rows shade each other. At the bottom, the row is shaded by the other row adjacent to it. Again, if you've designed your project properly, you've left enough space between the rows, so that shouldn't be an issue. On rooftops, where you've got a limited amount of space that you're working with, sometimes you do crowd the arrays a little bit. Sometimes you have to work close to a rooftop obstruction like an air handling unit that for part of the day is going to cast some shade over a nearby module. In those instances, I think multi-MPPT makes sense, but for utility scale applications, we just don't see the value of the multi-MPPT in terms of yield increment.
All right, well, let's move on to number 4. We'll keep hitting these here. The ecosystem performance ratio and CapEx. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so we like to look at just not a inverter to inverter cost differential, right? So we have these single MPPT inverters, and often people say, well, they're kind of small, right? They're 125, 155, 165 kilowatt units. There are string inverters on the market that are 250, 255, 350, 333. So there's bigger units on the market, and the argument is, well, if I use bigger units, I need less of them. My install cost is going to be lower, which makes sense when you think about it initially, but you have to look at the total ecosystem cost of the system that you're putting together, right? So that includes the installation cost, the hardware cost, the the cabling costs, because with these larger units, they tend to have their outputs at 800 volts AC, and they are made for distributed architecture deployment, which means you mount them at the end of the row, and then you have 800 volt AC 3-phase wiring that has to run underground back to wherever your step-up transformer is. All right, versus what we call a virtual center or central or consolidated architecture where all the inverters are clustered together in close proximity to the inverter. The home run cabling from the array is done at 1500 volts DC. So it means you can use smaller conductors. You only need 2 of them, not 3, right? Smaller conductors, lower losses on those conductors. So that's going to affect the performance ratio of the total installation, right? And it's going to have some cost implications. The other impact is that with 800 volts AC, you need specialty switchgear, right? Normal switchgear, normal UL equipment is maximum 600 volts AC. So if you're doing an 800 volt output on your inverters, now you need either to use fused disconnect switches or breakers that are rated for a minimum 800 volts. Typically, they're then rated for 1,000 volts. There's very limited options there in terms of OEMs that have a UL approved product for a breaker for 1,000 volts AC, right? So you're limiting your options. Your cost of switchgear is going to be higher on the AC side. So you have to look at the entire ecosystem. So what we do for people is we say, okay, yes, my inverter might be a half a penny more expensive than the other guy's inverter, and I still maybe need a DC disconnect, but I am compatible with a fused cable trunking system, which is going to save you a penny a watt if you deploy that type of solution on your wiring costs on the DC side. Whereas the other guys, you have to bring individual string wiring and terminate it at their inverter. Right. So there's a cost differential there, right? You have to field install their inverters at end of row, which is going to cost you time and money, and that's at field labor rates, right? Whereas I will build you an inverter rack with all the inverters mounted on a rack with AC paralleling switchgear that's already pre-wired to it. So all that wiring is already done for you, and you just set it next to the transformer. Right. And so you wire it much the same way as you do a central inverter. You have to look at the entire ecosystem architecture in terms of its CapEx for deployment, completely installed. But then the other one is the performance ratio. Because of those cable losses on that 800 volts AC system, you're going to typically see a 0.5% lower performance ratio just because of the cable losses. You couple that on top of the 0.5% efficiency difference with the inverters. Now you've got a 1% performance ratio differential between the two designs that you're deploying. Again, that adds up to money in the bank because you're generating and selling more electricity onto the grid with a higher performance ratio.
Well, I think it also impacts your inventory. Whoever owns that facility, and if you've got 800 volt switch gear, if you got spares or things like that, you have to place those in your stock. There's carrying costs associated with that. You can't just use that anywhere. So
Yep.
there's some issues with that as well. And I think to your point, it's looking at the total ownership cost of the entire project versus getting transactional with each component. And if you do get transactional, then there's other issues to your point about the efficiency. So I agree. We have the same discussions on other products or other solutions that we sell, and you got to get people to realize that every action there's a reaction, and
Yep.
it impacts your entire project.
Oh yeah, there's definitely an O&M impact, right? So if you go the path of saying, well, okay, I'm not going to use those 1,000-volt breakers, I'm going to go with fused switchgear, fused disconnect type switchgear, and one of our OEM competitors has a product specifically for solar where they'll do a switchboard with fused disconnect. The problem with fuses is if there's a problem with the inverter and it causes an inrush current or a short circuit current, you've got a fuse blown. So now you've got a consumable that you have to deal with. And when I went and looked at the design, they don't have a main disconnect switch in that switchboard. It's just feeders. And I'm like, okay, so that means I've got to turn off the transformer that it's connected to on the primary side in order to go in and change a fuse. Like, holy cow, that's a nuisance. I am not doing that anytime soon, right? So you have to look at the O&M implications of your design as well, because they can come back and bite you, right? And unfortunately, the procurement guys don't always talk with the O&M people, right? They're focused on cost. Their metrics are driven off of first CapEx cost, and solar is highly CapEx driven because there's no fuel cost on these projects, right? The sunshine is free, at least for now. Nobody's figured out how to tax sunshine yet. But let's give them some time. Could happen, right? If they can tax carbon, they can certainly tax sunshine. So let's not hold our breath there.
Now, don't give them any idea.
I don't want to. I'm sure they've already thought about it. But this is a consideration that we have to take into account, is that O&M element of it too.
Great points. Next one you have here is grid standards. Let's go into that one.
Sure. So, grid standards are evolving. They always have. California has been the leader, for the longest time in adopting new and more stringent grid standards, primarily because they're seeing, higher levels of penetration of renewables on their grid, and with higher levels of penetration come challenges, right? Challenges with frequency and voltage regulation, challenges with dealing with the duck curve, which drove the requirement for storage implementation in California faster than it did anywhere else in the country. But we're very quickly seeing a shift. Texas for the last couple of years has been the biggest place for new installations, especially for larger utility scale projects. It's the number one state for the last couple of years for solar deployments. So there's a shift there. So ERCOT standards have become, kind of the new de facto standard. It used to be Cal ISO was what you had to deal with. Now it's become ERCOT. And there's the standard that governs inverters is UL 1741. It's been out for a long time. Since I've been in the industry, it's existed. And I got in the industry in 2008. But it's been, amended every couple of years. There's new adoptions of new rules. They had the Supplement A that was adopted. Now we're in Supplement B adoption. We're starting to see jurisdictions requiring the SB certification, Supplement B certification. We've also seen changes in the modeling requirements, the dynamic modeling requirements for the inverter. So, we have to have PV-SYST models, obviously, so that we can model yield, but we also have to have the dynamic models, PSCAD, PSSE, PSLF, for the inverters. And different utilities have started to adopt changes to what they require from the inverter models. So we've had to make, amendments to our models, hire, specialty software companies to, remodel the units to be able to deal with the requirements of interconnection applications that our customers are seeing. So the most stringent one we've seen, for example, is unusually it's in the state of Maine. So we had to come up with an amended model for inverters about a year ago just to deal with the requirements for the state of Maine. So this is something you have to understand when you're doing a project. What are the interconnection requirements? What am I going to have to be complying with the frequency and voltage ride-through capabilities of the units? What other requirements are there? And then I think the last one that's still not quite fully baked is cybersecurity, right? What cybersecurity rules may be implemented still by NERC and FERC that we haven't yet got full coverage on. I think that's going to be the next frontier, in terms of requirements. As we increase the level of adoption of distributed energy resources, of large-scale solar, it becomes a concern that these resources are susceptible to foreign actors hacking into them. And Christopher Wray of the CIA has testified before Congress a couple of times in the last 3 months about his concern over infrastructure weaknesses in the U.S. and cybersecurity weaknesses specifically on infrastructure, on water, on power plants. And this is a concern, I think, that we see it taken more seriously by the investor-owned utilities that we work with than by the IPPs. The independent power producers are aware of cybersecurity concerns, but I think they are less focused on them because they don't answer to anyone. An IOU answers to a Public Utilities Commission. If one of their power plants was hacked and shut down and it impacted grid reliability, caused a brownout, or worse, a blackout, they would have to answer to the PUCs. The IPPs don't. They answer to the investors. And so I think that's why there's less of a focus there, but I think that will change over time, and all it takes is one event for it to change, right? And the world we live in is not stable, as we've seen over the last couple of years. Wars break out at a moment's notice, and we have to be cognizant of the risks to our infrastructure. And I view solar in general and solar supply chain as a national security issue, right? This is why I think the Inflation Reduction Act was a good idea. Localization, encouraging localization of manufacturing of modules, of inverters, of other hardware, I think is a good idea, just because we cannot be sure that our supply chains will be intact from one year to the next. We must come up with a energy security strategy, which is long term.
That's important stuff. I mean, I think that as solar's, it's not going backwards. We're going to see it be a more and more of a bigger part of the overall production of electricity in this country and worldwide. So you got to take care of these issues now, from especially cybersecurity. It's an issue that's only going to get greater and greater as solar is adopted heavy and heavier in other parts of the country. So, and then we saw, to your point about wars, we saw in Ukraine, the first thing that Russia went for was the electrical grid. Yep. And if you're going to bring a nation to its knees right out of the gate, the electrical grid is a vulnerable place. Everything that we have runs on electricity, and it's getting more and more like that. So we got to protect it and protect it well.
Agreed.
Are you guys seeing how fast you mentioned, to deal with these cybersecurity threats that you guys are talking about, and even just policy changes like in Maine, like you said, how fast are these coming down the pipeline? How hard is it to kind of manage all these changes, all these things, security threats? Like how, for Siemens, obviously you guys have a lot of resources to deal with this kind of stuff. How
Yeah.
difficult of an issue is it?
I mean, the standards changes, they tend to evolve fairly gradually. Like the SB was published 2.5 years before anyone started implementation. So there was plenty of time to, ensure that the products would meet that. When we get a surprise sometimes when we suddenly have a local utility that implements something that's different than the national standards. So when Maine implemented a change in what they wanted to see for the dynamic modeling, okay, that was a bit of a whoops, we didn't catch that one early enough. We try to participate in various industry associations, sit on committees to understand what's coming. It's difficult though, because the grid in the United States is a conglomeration of multiple different rule sets. There is not a national interconnection standard for renewables. It's very, very much a patchwork quilt of interconnection standards, and so we have to try to stay on top of it. So I won't say that we're always in front of it, but we try to be as much as possible. On the cybersecurity front, I think Siemens is got a very good handle on that from a couple of perspectives. One is that we have a consultation business that just helps customers with cybersecurity as a service, right? So we do cybersecurity as a service within Siemens, and we'll go into a customer and evaluate their IT infrastructure, evaluate their file storage methodologies, make recommendations to them, and try to beef up their cybersecurity. From a product development perspective, we have very specific rules which we follow for any IoT product. Anything that's going to be networked has to go through a certain level of cybersecurity testing, in order to be launched to the marketplace. We are also very, very cautious about where we get firmware written and by whom, right? So this is another thing is, it doesn't take much for someone to implant malicious code in something. So you have to be a little bit cognizant of the people that you have working on projects, and just be very cautious there, and vet people and make sure that you are, ensuring that the products are fully tested before they go to market.
Let's talk about number 6 on the list. Talk about
Sure.
warranty and bankability. If you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, what I always tell people that is, the 5 year or longer warranty that you're getting from your inverter manufacturer, and that's the standard in the industry. But I tell people that warranty is only good as the company that's standing behind it, and unfortunately, the inverter manufacturing marketplace that space is littered with the rotting carcasses of many companies that have gone bankrupt. Either bankrupt completely or decided to exit the US market, for strategic reasons, or sold off their business to another entity, which then made it impossible to get warranty coverage for whatever reason. So I could list off probably 8 or 9 or 10 different companies who, a decade ago or 5 years ago were big names in inverters, and they no longer exist today, and there's no longer any support for their products in the market, or getting support is very, very difficult. We are starting to see a lot of projects that are, that were deployed 7 to 10 years ago that are at the stage where they are so frustrated with their inability to get support, that they are considering repowering, meaning they'll tear out the existing inverters and put something else in to replace them, something new. That's not how those projects were designed. They were typically designed with the idea that the inverters would run for 15, 20, maybe even 25 years. The reality is that they aren't, and they can't get service. They can't get parts. They can't get people out there that know how to work on the units. They can't get replacement, units if a unit fails catastrophically and it's not repairable. And that is a real challenge for these asset owners, because they end up having portion of the solar array that's essentially stranded. It can't get its power back onto the grid if there's no inverter in between. It's a challenge. It's something that I caution people, and bankability, in solar basically means, is that company going to be around for the duration of the warranty? Are they going to stand behind the product? Do they have a obsolescence plan? So when products do go obsolete, because they inevitably do, how long will they support that product with parts and service and personnel after fact. I mean, we're supporting products that Siemens deployed back in 2006, 2007. We're still supporting those. It's not easy, but we're still supporting them. You know, we have products that were deployed in the 2015-17 range that we're supporting, you know, that are obsolete and have been since probably 2018. You know, but we're still supporting those products, and we have parts, we have service, we have personnel that are trained on them. We've also trained our customers on how to be self-sufficient to a large degree. You know, we're doing what we can there. So ask the questions. Where are you going to do warranty support? Where are the spare parts held? Where are spare units retained? You know, how many spare units do you keep in stock as a percentage of the deployed fleet of units that you have? Because with string inverters, there's only a couple of things that get done from an O&M perspective on the units in the field. Most of the failures involve an RMA swap, meaning the unit comes back to a repair center and a new unit is deployed and installed and you know, put into service. You know, so you have to understand how that's going to be supported by the OEM you're working with.
This is an important point. All manufacturers globally look at solar as it's a gold rush for them. So you got people who really aren't players in this field. All of a sudden they are players. They're warrantying stuff for 5 years, and they've even been in business for 5 years. We saw this on LED lighting when the transition from HID lighting to LED lighting, when most of the time there's a 10-year warranty with these type fixtures. There were companies giving 10-year warranties that had only been in business for a year. And now there's a lot of customers having to pick up the pieces because there's nobody there to support it. So having a name like Siemens backing it, knowing that they are in the business, they've been in the business, and they're going to be there when things come up, that's important. That's an important part of it. You know, it's like the old days when I always heard, you know, hey, no one ever got fired by buying IBM, right? I think a lot of that goes with Siemens. Siemens is going to be a player in this space globally.
Yeah, and
Agreed.
I think that moves into number 7 too. How easy is it field maintenance and swaps? Like how easy it is to do this thing? So let's maybe move into that.
Yeah, so on our string inverters that we deploy, there's only a couple of field replaceable items, and we made them real simple to replace. They are the fans in the unit, so they're an air-cooled inverter, and they have 3 sort of square fans that are about, I don't know, 4 inches square. With one tool in about 5 minutes, I could replace, you know, all 3 fans if I needed to, if there was a failure. So basically, it's an Allen key, pop open a cover, and then the fans themselves aren't even bolted in place. They use a twist lock mechanism into the sheet metal. So they just twist out, pop them. There's a quick multi-wire connector, and then you snap a new one in, boom, you're back up and running again. That's one of the field replaceable items. We've got a video online that shows how that's done and how easy it is. The other consumable item is surge protectors, right? So we have surge protectors on the AC, DC side, can also add them as an option on the communication line incoming to the units. And those are all using socket connectors. So they're the field replaceable style SPDs. They're not hard soldered into position on the printed circuit board. So there's a socket. They pop in and out. And they also have an indicator on them that tells you when that SPD has taken enough voltage transients that it's failed. Right. So there's a visual indicator on that unit that tells you if it needs replacing. So those are kind of the 2 field replaceable items that we've traditionally, you know, done. We're now migrating a little bit where we've got a couple of the printed circuit boards that we will do a swap on. If we can isolate the problem through troubleshooting, we'll authorize a swap of a PCB in the field. It's a little more tricky to do because of you're working outside. You got to make sure it's, you know, it's not raining when you do it, that you're wearing anti-static protective gloves, et cetera, right? So you have to be careful when you're handling a PCB like that. So there's some extra precautions that have to be taken. And then any other swap is basically an RMA swap, meaning you remove the AC and DC cable connections to the inverter, you pop it off its mounting bracket, and you ship it back to us, and you replace it with a spare unit. And a lot of customers will keep a spare on site. If not, we typically can ship a spare out within 48 hours of getting notification that one is required. And you know, we have a call center where people call in. They can also log a case through a web portal. We answer their calls. We try to troubleshoot the unit with them. If it can't be got up and running again, just through some troubleshooting steps, then we'll authorize that RMA swap. The other thing is, you know, how heavy is the unit itself? The units that we deploy, these 125, 155 kW units, they weigh less than 80 kilograms. So 2 people can, with a little bit of effort, but 2 people can lift one off the wall and set it down and pop a new one on. on its mounting bracket. So, they're just under that weight threshold where two people can comfortably do it. Anything bigger than that is really going to require some kind of a lift assist device. And when you look at some of our competitors' products, these 250, 350 kW units, they weigh, north of 240, 250 pounds, just too heavy for two people to lift. Can't be done. You can't really get a third person in there. It's not really conducive to that, to do a lift. So you're going to require some kind of sling lift assist device to get it dismounted and swapped out. So that's another consideration to think about on the O&M side is, how easy is it to field repair or field replace a unit when a problem does occur? Because problems will always occur, right? All products, regardless of how well they're designed, will have field problems, but you have to be mindful of that.
Got it. And then especially talking about utility scale, things like that, number 8 you have here is scalability and flexibility. So what should people think about when they're thinking about that topic?
Sure. So a lot of the target market for string inverters and utility scale is definitely the community solar space, the 1 to 5 megawatt, but we do see people deploy them on larger projects as well. And one of the reasons is that scalability and flexibility. So because of the way we do it, where we mount the inverters on racks with paralleling switchgear and then close couple to a step transformer, we can make a block size of any size really, right? So depending on how many inverters we rack, and the size of the transformer, we can adjust that from 1 megawatt, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 5 megawatt block sizes are relatively easy for us to deploy. So that gives you flexibility when you have unusual topologies of the site that you're working with, where they can't cut it up into nice, regular rectangular DC size blocks. If you have irregular DC blocks, it means that you're going to have irregular AC block. And the string inverters give you that flexibility. Other thing I always tell people is, make sure that if you've got a point of interconnection maximum, power rating that you can't exceed with the utility as part of your interconnection agreement, it may be sometimes necessary to have the ability to derate an inverter, right? So you add all the inverters up, you're using the 155s, and without derating, you're just over the 5 megawatt threshold. Well, you can take one unit and hard program it. Our commissioning guys will do it behind a password that only our guys have, and we'll write you a letter to the effect that it's been derated. So that one unit's derated to 140 kilowatts. It'll never output more than that. And by doing that, we can ensure that you meet your limitation requirements at the point of common coupling with the utility for your interconnection agreement. So this is another flexibility thing that you have to be mindful of, that sometimes you have an unusual requirement from the utility. How are you going to deal with that? How's the OEM going to help you get there?
All right. Well, let's talk about installed base and history, number 9.
Sure. So the other thing I tell people is don't buy serial number 1, and frankly, don't buy serial number 100 from a new product that hits the market. Almost every inverter product that I've ever seen hit the market in the US has had issues with the first installed units. There's always some bugs to get ironed out, right? You want to be mindful of that. A couple of years ago, people were all hot on 250 kilowatt string inverters were hitting the market in droves from a couple of competitors. At least 2 of those competitors had to withdraw that product from the market and go through a redesign process because they had some significant problems when they were fielded. They were having catastrophic failures. They were having covers blow off. They were having interconnection, requirement issues. There was multiple problems that I heard from multiple different EPCs and developers that had tried to deploy those first units. So be mindful of that. Just, get some information from your OEM. How many are installed in the US? What customers are using them? What's their experience been like? See if you can't get, the name of a contact from one of those, references. Talk to them, see how they feel about the support they've been getting, how the installation went, how, the commissioning process was, how the SCADA implementation worked on the units, right? So just make sure that you're doing your homework on any product that you're fielding, and just be a little bit leery about being the first customer to deploy a brand new product in the marketplace. It's always challenging when you launch a new product. There are always issues, but how the OEM deals with those issues can mitigate, but you also want to be a little bit cautious.
It goes back to the bankability. I think it ties right back into what we were talking about
It does.
before. Is make sure you're partnering with a partner that's going to be there in the end.
Yep. All right. Last one we have here, domestic content implications. So let's hit
Sure.
that one, and then we'll hit the bonus.
Yeah, so this is a big one since the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a bonus 10% tax credit that's available if you can hit the domestic content thresholds on your project. And there's kind of two litmus tests that you have to pass. One is that your structural steel has to be sourced from U.S. suppliers. So your racking or your trackers, that's a pretty straightforward one. The second litmus test is that the manufactured products that you use on your project, so the inverters, transformers, switchgear, all of that stuff, you have to hit a content threshold of US content on those components. And the threshold for projects commencing construction this year is 40%. It goes up 5% a year based on commencement date until it caps out at 55% in a few years. And then that'll be the maximum level that's required. The challenge right now is that you would think the easiest way to do that would be with US sourced solar modules. Okay, that's the great idea because this solar module accounts for 40 to 50% of your project cost on the CapEx side for the manufactured components anyway. So if you could source a US module, wonderful. But even a US manufactured module does not necessarily constitute 100% US content. So what they actually have to do as a module manufacturer is declare the source of the raw materials. So the glass, the aluminum frame, the cells, or the thin film, if it's a thin film module, where are those manufactured, right? The backsheet, the encapsulant layer, the junction box, all of those components, they have to declare where those are coming from, and they get to only count the items that are from US sub-suppliers, right? Or if they're vertically integrated and doing it in-house, great, that works too, plus their direct labor. So it's a cost basis driven thing of material and direct labor, but they have to actually declare the content levels of the different components. So right now, you can buy modules from the one thin film guy in the US. They've probably got a very high content module. It's probably 70, 80% US content. Maybe that's enough if you're lucky enough to be one of the customers that can buy from them, because they've my understanding is they've basically sold out through 2027 their US capacity. There are also some module manufacturers right now who are saying, well, we can give you a module that is 20, 25%, somewhere in that range, US content, because we source the frame, we source the junction box, maybe the backsheet layer from US suppliers plus the labor, so there's crystalline module manufacturers in the US that are at that level. There's also one crystalline module company that I'm aware of that's told me they're in the 40 to 45% level. I'm not quite sure how they got there, but that's what they say. So there may be modules that can help you there, but they won't get you fully to the level of content that you need on your project for all the manufactured goods that you're ordering. So inverters, if you're trying to get that content threshold, inverters and the transformers that go with them might be an important element to help you get over that content threshold in order to ensure that you can capture that. So we can help you with that. The inverters that we're manufacturing have a certain level of US content that will increase over time as we domesticate more. I should mention that we've just opened a string inverter manufacturing facility in Wisconsin with a contract manufacturing partner. Products are starting to roll off the line this month in May. We'll be ramping up the full production between now and July, and then we'll be building about 420 units per month will be the monthly capacity for a single shift there. So we're moving very quickly to domesticate it, and we're going to be increasing the content threshold over time on those inverters by domesticating the printed circuit boards, domesticating the enclosure. So over time, over the next 6 to 12 months, the content level of the inverter itself will increase over, incrementally from, the level it's at now to eventually be over 50, 55%. All right. So that's good. That can help you get there. We can also work with you to source transformers that are made in the US if that's necessary to help you get some over that content hump. And then the other thing is that when we take our inverters and we mount them in the rack structure as this virtual central, that inverter is then considered from a US factory. So it doesn't matter what the content inside the inverter is. It becomes a subcomponent of the new manufactured product, the rack, as well as the panel board. So the AC paralleling panel board that we mount on there is coming from a US facility. So when we do that, we believe that we can declare that rack structure as 95% US content today. We have presented that case to the US Department of Treasury as to why we believe that's the interpretation of the rules. We're waiting on a final dispensation and ruling on that. There's more guidance still pending from Treasury on the rules around manufactured products. But we have made that case. A similar case has been made by some of the tracker companies as to some of the components that they sell that are considered manufactured products. So we're kind of waiting on Treasury's final ruling, but we believe that this is going to be a pathway to help our customers significantly get to that U.S. content threshold on their projects when they can't get modules that alone that will get them there. So it's a complicated subject. It's a subject which is still not quite fully baked because the final the final rules are not out. But it's a subject that we watch very closely, and we have our government affairs people in Washington lobbying on our behalf, to hopefully get the ruling that we would like to see there.
Yeah, complicated stuff, but lots of savings to be had, right? If you can do it right.
Let's think about it, right? If you're building a 100-megawatt project, 10% is another $10 million in your pocket, right? That can make or break the economics on a project very easily, right? And it's scalable. If it's a 10-megawatt project, it's $1 million extra in your pocket in tax credits. So these things are huge. And will really drive, the adoption. And the part of the argument we made with Treasury is, look, the steel structure that we're building this rack is all U.S. steel. The other components are coming from U.S. factories. The intent of the legislation was to create U.S. jobs, and we're doing that, right? We're building the panel boards in the U.S. We're building the inverters in the U.S. We're building the racks in the U.S. We're creating jobs to drive this solar supply chain in the right direction. And we are, as time permits, increasing the content levels of the inverters, but we can't do it overnight because a lot of the changes that we make to the supply chain trigger us to have to recertify the product, right? We have to go back through UL and get the product retested, recertified whenever we change anything in the electrical circuit that has implications on our UL listing. So, it's complicated. It can't be done instantly. We're doing it as fast as we can. We're asking for a little bit of leeway here in the rules interpretation.
Perfect. Lots of really good information. I think people are going to benefit from this. Let's hit the bonus before we close off that you had. Moving into what's the threshold between smaller, larger projects, string inverters to central inverters.
I get asked a lot about this, this question of when's the right, project size cutoff point where I switch from string inverters to centrals. And I think it depends on a number of factors, right? It depends on your experience. Like a lot of European developers are more familiar with doing large projects with string inverters, 100 megawatt plus projects. They do them in Europe all the time with string inverters. They're very common to deploy. So if it's a European developer, they may be more prone to that because it's their experience having built them that way, and they've had good experience with it. I think personally that it's a combination of economics and risk that you have to look at, right? The string inverters are more expensive to deploy than centrals. So a central inverter station with the inverter plus the transformer, stepping into 34.5 kV, which is kind of the typical collection voltage on a larger project. And then they go up to a grid tie substation that steps it up to transmission level, usually where they're interconnecting. But 34.5 is the collection voltage for the on-site. You're talking 5 cents per watt AC for central inverter stations. That's not a bad price. When you go to the virtual central from us, that string inverter topology, you're probably looking at more like 11 to 12 cents. So it's more than double the price. Okay, well, but what about spare parts you have to keep on site? Well, with a central inverter, you've got to train your O&M people. They typically have to go through a certification. With a lot of the OEMs, they won't let you do certain things. They'll only let their own personnel repair it. So if you have a failure of a unit, you might be waiting for a field service technician from the OEM to come. We have a different approach to that. We tend to train our customers' O&M personnel on how to fix just about everything, but most of the OEMs out there don't do that. They force you to use their service personnel, their people. So, that can be a factor in decision making. The spare parts you have to keep on site. If you have central inverter, you might be looking at $150,000, $200,000 worth of spare parts that you have to keep in a secure lockup on site. So it's spare contactors, breakers, relays, IGBT stacks, IGBT devices, inductors, control board. There's a fans, a myriad of parts you have to keep on site with a central. With string inverters, it's some fans and surge protectors and maybe a spare unit or two, right? So you're probably looking at more like $15,000 worth of spares. So one-tenth the spares cost output that's sitting there on site, collecting dust, waiting for a problem. The other big one is, when a failure occurs of a string inverter, even if it's a catastrophic failure, right, where you've got to rip and replace the unit, you can be back up and running in 3-4 hours. And you've only lost 125 or 150 kilowatts of output for that period. With a central inverter, you could be, if it's a relatively simple failure, you might be up the same day, but you could lose 4 to 6 hours, while you're getting authorization to proceed. If your own personnel can perform it, great. If it means field service personnel from the OEM have to come out, you might be waiting a few days, right? If it requires parts that you don't have, you could be waiting a week or longer, depending on if those parts are in country. So it's a question you have to ask is, where are spare parts kept for those units if they're not parts that you're holding yourself? The other one is, if a catastrophic failure occurs of a central inverter, I mean, you could be waiting tens of weeks for a replacement inverter, right? Typically, OEMs don't stock full spares. We do. We keep a couple of spare central inverters in Texas, but most OEMs don't keep spares in country. So they would have to come from overseas, because the major inverter competitors are German, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese, right? That's where they're coming from. So, this is a factor. And if you're if you have a catastrophic failure of a central inverter, you could be losing a 4.5 megawatt block for weeks, right? So the energy harvest loss is substantial. What I tell people is, look, my personal feeling is projects that are, maybe above 25 megawatts, where you would be deploying 5 or 6 central inverters. That's when, I switch over and do it with centrals. Projects smaller than that, I would recommend doing with strings. The other exception, though, is when you have unusual geographic topology. So we have a project in upstate New York designed by one of our developer partners. It's 270 megawatts AC. It's in 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, and 3 megawatt AC blocks. So they're doing it with the virtual central, inverter stations, because the land was such that it had forested area they weren't touching. It had swampy area they weren't touching. It's a conglomeration of multiple different farms that they, merged together into one plot of land with multiple leases from the landowners. So it's a bit of a chopped up site. There's some undulation to the land as well, which made it unusable, right? So that jobs like that, where you can't use nice rectangles of DC, make it less conducive to use centrals, because a lot of the centrals are monolithic, meaning that they're one size, right? Like our unit is 4.5 megawatt or 4.3 megawatt, but it's one unit. If I had to use it on where I only need 3 megawatt, it means I'm just derating it. I'm not getting my value, and it doesn't change the price of the unit. It's still the same price as the 4.5. So that's problematic. Now, there are modular central inverter designs that are out there, where you can go with blocks of 1 or 1.1 megawatt, and you can have 3 blocks, 4 blocks, 2 blocks. Those are a little more scalable for those sites. But there's some drawbacks to that I won't get into, that, around efficiency and so on, with units like that. So there's some challenges no matter what you do. I do have customers in the US who swear by doing projects as big as 75 megawatts with string inverters, and then only above that do they migrate to central. So it's really about your experience. Customers who've had a bad experience with a central inverter sometimes tend to be more prone to go with string inverters. And I had a customer tell me, I thought this was a good one. He said, or she said, that the inverter that you like the best is the one you've never deployed before. And this is kind of true, because everybody has problems, right? The thing is, how do you deal with them? How do you solve those problems? How do you bring your team to bear to, come together, work with the customer, get through whatever challenges there are? Every single solar project I've ever been involved in has had challenges on the execution side, and it's just the way it is. I mean, you're building stuff outdoors. That's the way it goes, right? The weather doesn't cooperate. Logistics challenges, hit you. You get freight damage of components. How do you rise to the occasion, solve those problems as quickly as possible? And it's not always as quickly as everybody would like, but nonetheless, you work through those things with your customer, and you never abandon a project.
Good nuance there. Well, let's close off on the final bonus, and that
Yeah.
is the financing piece. Will you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So Siemens Financial Services is an entity within the Siemens portfolio, the Siemens parent organization. who take care of all manner of financing on projects. They will participate in some instances as secondary tax equity investors, secondary equity investors. They don't participate as tax equity typically, but they will act as a secondary equity investor on a project or project portfolio. They can provide long-term debt financing. So there's an equity group and a debt group. So they can be the long-term debt financier on a renewable project. They can provide also construction financing, so short-term debt financing to the developer before the project goes to COD, and they can flip that into long-term debt as well. So they have those the ability to do those, and then more recently they've started to act as equity investors in actual companies. So they are, investing in solar developers and other companies in the renewable energy space, whether they be equipment manufacturers. So they'll act as an equity investment, an infusion of first or second round capital into an actual company to help it stand up, and then their expectation, of course, is some of the dividends that result as an outcome from the projects that are executed by that entity. So they have a multitude of different methodologies of investing in the renewable space. They've deployed several $billion of capital into renewable energy projects worldwide, and I can connect customers who are interested in Siemens Financial Services participating in their projects. I can connect them on opportunities. The other thing I would say is we've done some unusual things in the past with customers. We've invested with customers to provide them letters of credit to support the deposits that they had to make for interconnection agreements and PPA agreements, in exchange for some preferential treatment when the time comes for equipment selection, right? Not meaning that you have to use us, but that we kind of get a last look and an opportunity to match the pricing in the marketplace that you're able to secure, right? So, it's another thing that Siemens can do, is to help developers where cash flow may be challenging, to do some things there. And I guess the last thing I would say about Siemens is that, we understand the challenges of the solar developers and solar EPCs, and we have some flexibility in terms of how we structure, the payment milestones and due dates for, equipment on these projects, because we understand how challenging it can be and how tight the cash flows can be on projects. And we're willing to work with customers to make sure that they can, get their projects executed. If they work with us, we can be very, very flexible in that regard.
Well, thank you, Rudy. And I think everything you shared is going to be super useful for folks. The 10 things to consider and think through before you're doing these projects, plus 2 bonuses. So we really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for being here.
No, thank you. I appreciate you guys. It's a wonderful experience.